Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. I'm Shannon McNulty. I'm an estate planning attorney and founder of the Village Law Firm in New York City. We do a lot of work, both from the tax planning piece of it and the estate planning piece of it for cross-border individuals and families. And I'm joined here by my esteemed colleague, Steve Maggi. Maggi, I'm sorry, is Maggi, right?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I am. I'm of Italian descent, not Irish, so yes.
Yeah, I'm still in St. Patrick's Day mode. So Steve was a former classmate of mine at Georgetown Law School, and he is an immigration attorney. We decided to do this webinar in light of the kind of current political and legal landscape with respect to immigration. That's causing a lot of concern among our clients and not unwarranted. And so, both from kind of like protecting yourself, protecting your family, and also people considering just like they just don't want to even be here anymore, and leaving the country. So in this sort of discussion, we're going to address both the immigration landscape, and also kind of the tax legal landscape, especially for people who may be leaving. Um, Steve, do you want to say a few words about yourself, about what we'll be talking about?
Sure. So I'm originally from Argentina, and the reason I became an immigration attorney is because my mom, born and raised in New York, moved to Argentina when she was 18, and she could not, when my parents split up, I was 5 years old, she could not get me a passport because of a strange quirk in the law that said that you cannot get a passport for a child born abroad if you haven't lived as an adult for at least 1 year in the US. So I had to go through several immigration processes as a child, and it took me 9 years to become a US citizen. And that was the seed that was planted in my immigrant experience that led me to become an immigration lawyer eventually. And then I've been doing that since, well, pretty much since Shannon and I graduated in 2001. I think it's important for people to understand how the immigration system works, and it's very complex. To understand and really prepare for all the different barriers that could exist. And some of those we're seeing on TV that we hadn't seen before. So I thought it was a good time. And we've done a lot of podcasts before, Shannon, but I really thought this was a good time for us to talk about what today looks like and maybe tomorrow.
Yes, absolutely. So, before we dive in, I just want to uh, have you answer a poll. And this is just want to get your thoughts, just so we make sure we're addressing your particular concerns. If you can just click on the areas or the issues that are concerning to you, it will give us a better idea of how to kind of focus our discussion. And we'll just give you a minute to read through. There's a lot of options there, so and I can actually read them. So, one is what to do if I'm stopped by ICE. That's a unfortunately increasing concern for people. What to do if I'm detained. How to protect my kids if I'm detained. Applying for a green card or citizenship in the current immigration climate. Tax and estate planning implications of relocating outside the US as a US citizen, and tax and estate planning implications of relocating outside the US as a green card holder. And it looks like we have interest in all of those topics, some more than others, but these are things that we will address each of these topics. So thank you for your thoughts and your feedback on that. Um, okay, so I think what we will I'm going to start off with is to have Steve talk a little bit about immigration and the current landscape with respect to he has many-headed dragons he thinks about. He kind of like has his framework for thinking about these issues, and he's going to explain that. And then I'll talk about the kind of tax and estate planning, both with respect to protecting your kids while you're here, and then also leaving the US and what we need to be on the lookout for if we're planning on relocating. So, Steve, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Sure. Yeah, the dragon metaphor. So Shannon and I were discussing this when I've done presentations in the past. I always talked about the three-headed dragon, which is the U.S. immigration system. ICE has now become the fourth because it is playing a much more prominent role than we have ever seen. Um, so the point of this metaphor, well, there are four sort of separate entities that work within the immigration system. The one that foreign nationals are probably most familiar with is the Department of State, which controls the embassies and the consulates. That's where people apply for temporary and longer term or permanent visas. Okay, so that's the first barrier to entry for certain people. Depending on where you are in this, there are different barriers that you have to overcome. And depending on what your status is, if you're a green card holder or a visa holder or applicant, you may have to deal with three or up to even four of those. The second one is Customs and Border Protection, which are the one that control the borders, which includes in most cases the airports, and decide, are you admissible as an applicant to enter? Are you admissible legally? And for how long will they allow you to enter the United States? Then you have USCIS, which is Immigration Services, which is the one that adjudicates millions of petitions per year, and a lot of those are green card, citizenship, employment-based visas, and what's called a change of status or adjustment of status, where you shift your status within the United States from one legal status to another. And then the last one is ICE, which is rearing its ugly head now with these massive detentions and raids and violating people's due process, etc. That, if you see me talk on TV, it's usually not about the other three heads of the dragon. It's usually about what you see on television, which is the detentions and potential removals or deportations of people. So the message that I give people is to not fall on the side of paranoia. Try to be informed and be preventative. Doesn't mean you can't live your life, but you have to be very cautious as compared to a couple of years ago.
So, Steve, can you tell us about what um, I guess if people are applying for green cards, applying for citizenship, I know that there's a lot of um, concern about, and I just know from my clients talking to me, from you discussing things with you, that if you are looking to, say, adjust your status to apply for a green card, or apply for citizenship, something like that, or come to the U.S. Originally, what are we looking at right now? What does that
Well,
landscape look like?
I don't want it to sound like a self-plug, but I think that under other administrations, there might have been processes like citizenship or maybe family-based green card cases that you could have presented on your own. Like if your parent is sponsoring the child or things like that, where there's not a lot of probative requirements. It's mostly paperwork, same for citizenship, that you could have probably done it successfully up until this recent administration. Now there is absolutely not one immigration process that I would recommend people not do with an experienced attorney, because the reality is they are trying to deny cases. And that means that you misanswered a question on a form, you left something blank, uh, misrepresented something because you didn't understand how to answer the question, like have you ever been arrested, charged, or convicted? That question is a big problem for people who might have been arrested but then acquitted. So they think, I don't have a record. But the question doesn't ask, do you have a criminal record? It asks, have you been arrested, charged, or convicted of a crime in any country? Right? So things like that is just an example of how something that appears to be simple can derail a case, and that can sometimes lead to people falling out of status, which is very risky. And the same goes for applying. You mentioned people abroad applying for a visa. You have to submit something called a DS-160 form, which has, I think, something like 120 questions. You don't quote me on that, but it's a lot of questions. And if you don't answer one of them correctly, it's a red flag, and there's a much higher chance you will be denied. So even something as simple as filling out a form for a tourist visa application right now is fraught with peril. If you don't know how to do it, you need to work with an expert, and an expert that knows that specific nuance or that specific form. Not just someone that you know from the neighborhood that was recommended that did your mom's, visa application. When it's a totally separate kind of application, you need an expert in that specific kind of petition. Because they are trying to deny every case that they can, even on just completely trivial things that you would not think are material. They become material, and they become the justification for denials. And so people just need to be very careful when they're taking these steps to do it with a fine-tooth comb, as we say.
Right. No, I think that's really good advice because we are seeing, and I just see it in the news all the time of like there's like some little paperwork mishap in terms of a visa application, and they're using that kind of as a pretext almost to deport
Yes,
people because
absolutely.
they want to deport them for whatever reason. And then in terms of applying for a green card, applying for citizenship, is the timing of that, should people go ahead and do that? Should they maybe wait and see if there's a different administration in a few years? What is your advice on that?
The stereotypical attorney response is it depends, right? It depends on case by case. The general rule is if you qualify for citizenship and you don't have arrests or something that could raise a red flag from the time you became a green card holder until the time you apply for citizenship, you should absolutely apply for citizenship because that gives you a much higher level of protection. It's pretty much impossible to be deported if you're a U.S. citizen. You could commit any sort of heinous crime. You could go to jail within the U.S. Criminal system, but you cannot be deported. And so the protections that you get as a citizen are infinitely higher than as a green card holder, and that goes obviously. It's in sort of inverse relationship. If you are only a visa holder, but you could have permanent residence, you will have more protections as a permanent resident than as a visa holder. So I always encourage people to go higher up and get closer to citizenship. There is a misnomer, we've talked about this separately, Shannon, that if you get denied for citizenship, that can affect your green card status. It cannot. So you make sure you talk to an attorney and say, do I run any risks if you have crimes committed or anything that makes me ineligible for citizenship, but also, if reported in the system, could trigger a deportation. In most cases, people who are eligible for citizenship should be applying for it, but you have to, this is really important, you have to tell the lawyer, if you've paid for a consultation, tell them everything. Because the only cases that I've had denied for citizenship are the ones where my clients withheld information about criminal activity or infractions, and then those were not ones that we could overcome later on. So that's a really important thing for people to understand. When they've hired an attorney, they need to tell them everything. immigration history, criminal history, anything that could potentially affect their future.
That's great, great advice. And in terms of what I think we used to not really be that concerned about people who are here legally being detained. Um, that's not the case anymore. And if you can speak a little bit to that possibility and what if you have advice for people on, if there are a way to avoid that situation or do things to protect themselves against being detained, what to do if they're stopped by ICE, or asked or questioned at the airport. And can you
Okay.
speak a little bit about those
Well,
apprehensions
yeah.
people have?
So number one, it depends on which status you're in, right? If you are in a status that triggers potentially deportability, if you've spent more than 2 years in the U.S. illegally, if you entered the country illegally, you've overstayed your visa, you don't have any protections at all. So what we're seeing, which is the most alarming, and I think what is waking people up in terms of Americans and their consciousness of what's happening, is it's also people that are in legal status that are being questioned. And you asked in your poll, you asked something like, what happens if I'm questioned by ICE? What happens if I'm detained by ICE? Those are two very different things. Questioned by ICE means that you are stopped and you are asked to show proof of your status. So the way you can avoid being detained, most of the time, unless it's a massive raid and they just throw everybody in a truck and they take them to a detention center, is you want to carry proof of your status. What does that mean? If you're here just as a tourist, you want to take a copy of your I-94. That's your latest travel entry record. That is the first thing that ICE will check. If you're not a green card holder, if you're a green card holder, a copy of your green card. If you're a U.S. citizen, we've seen cases of U.S. citizens being questioned, a copy of your passport bio page, or if you were born in the U.S., birth certificate. That's the least likely to have any issues, right? The native-born U.S. citizen. You want proof of your status. If you're in temporary visa status, you want your I-94 and also your approval notice for whatever petition was approved that allowed you to be in that working status. Copies. I do not suggest people walk around with originals. Why? Because if you have a green card, you have what's called an A number, alien number, the derogatory A number. I think it's derogatory to call someone an alien, but that's how they're designated. They will look that up and see you're a permanent resident. They have to release you. The same goes for the I-94. If it's intact and you're not breaking the law, they should be releasing you. The next level of precaution, Shannon, the one that I thought we would not need, is that you probably want the number of or the contact information for a specialist in deportations. That wouldn't be me, but that would be someone where you live, because anything that's immigration court related, deportations and asylum, is hyper local. So if you live in Newark or you live in Kansas City, you need to find a local deportation attorney and have their card or have their number, because then you can tell someone, if you are detained, that you have representation. When you tell them you have representation, they're much less likely to push forward with your case because they know they have to fight a lawyer on it, right? So, number one, documentation, the kind that I suggested depending on what your status is, and then the number two, the contact information of a deportation attorney. Going back to your question, Shannon, the only situation where I don't really have tangible advice to give, except with people that are illegal, is that you have to try to remain out of the system. You have to understand that if you are in public, that you are at greater risk, but certainly not a public profile online and things like that. Because if you're in the, they will check every media, social media platform. And the reason I know this is not paranoia, Shannon, is because on the DS-160 form now, they require every visa applicant to put all their social media platforms with their handles so the US government can actually look at their profiles.
And can you explain what that form is for us?
DS-160 is a Department of State form that's used for anyone who's applying for any temporary visa, tourist visa, student visa, work visa. You're required to fill out that form, and the information, then they will do the background check before your interview. So when you go to your interview, the decision is almost made, 90% made. And that's why you have to be very careful. So you should not have anything on your social media profile that indicates that you have interests that are not, that don't correspond to the visa you're applying for. And if you're in the US and you're not in status, you don't want to be on, you don't want to have, a lot of immigrants have Instagram accounts, for example. That is, they can probably find you and figure out that you're not legal somehow based on what you're posting. And so people have to just stay in the shadows and stay off social media as much as they can to minimize their risk.
And how about people who are in the process of applying for green cards, applying for citizenship? Does the same go for that for them?
No, but they still want to have proof. That's why I said even citizens should have proof on them. You know, we don't have identity cards in the US with photos that could make things easier in some ways. People don't want that for privacy reasons, but something that proves who you are, but from the federal government, not state, right? Something that's an official federal document, because immigration is federal, it's not state, right? So if you are in the process of applying for something else, you also want to have a receipt notice that proves that that case is pending. And you want a copy of it, and you want to just crumple it up, you know, fold it up and put it in your wallet or in your purse or bag or whatever it is, but have it on you. It's not a pleasant feeling to have to carry these things around, but you're just preventing things from happening. You're protecting yourself.
And how about like if they have it just like copies on their phone, is that enough? Or do you need to like actually like hang
I
it carefully?
suppose so, but do you really want to give an ICE official your phone? I wouldn't.
Really good point. Yeah.
Yeah, just take out the, look, here's my US citizenship proof, here's my green card proof, here's my proof of status, here's my I-94, here's my pending case. So they can go back and look it up in the system and decide, okay, this person can go. We're not going to send them to the detention center. Once you're in the detention center and you're being processed, it will take a lot longer to unravel all this and get you back on the street. One of my clients spent 20 days in detention. Because of just an error in the system. But she also didn't have these papers on her. And that probably would have nipped it in the bud and saved her all that trauma if she had.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Is there anything you want to add before we transition over? And we will have opportunity for questions. So please put your questions in the Q&A. But I do want to address some of the other issues before we get into that. Is
Yeah,
there
let's
anything?
go ahead.
Okay. Great. So, and I think one concern kind of coming from that, I hate to, keep coming back to the ICE, the detention, but a question that I have from a lot of my clients is what happens to my kids? Like, what if I'm detained, or what happens to my kids? And we've started adding to what's called a standby guardianship document, that if you're detained, that guardianship goes into effect if you are detained. It's not something we really were concerned about previously for our clients. But if you are one of our clients, we will be, and come revisiting those documents. If you are not a U.S. citizen, please get in contact with us, but we will be reaching out to update those. So a standby guardianship, and this is actually, I should clarify that this is specific to New York. Not every state has this, but it allows you to designate someone to serve as a temporary guardian for your child in the event that you're detained. So otherwise, often a court will need to be involved, and your kids could end up in like child custody, child protective services, or something like that. So that is one kind of pretty simple thing that we can do. But also just making sure that you have all of your estate planning documents in place. So a power of attorney is going to be important if you are detained because that's going to be somebody who can sign legal documents for you, who can pay bills for you, and you're not able to be there paying your mortgage and paying taking care of all of the financial things. So that's really important to have. Healthcare proxy, also very important to have. If you had a medical issue and you're in detention, you don't want whatever ICE doctor to be making those decisions for you. Um, so I would recommend that you definitely have like the power of attorney and healthcare proxy, and then the standby guardianship if you have minor children as well. The other thing that I'm going to be talking about is, unfortunately, we had people always left the US for various reasons, but unfortunately, we're in a environment where it's becoming increasingly hostile, both to immigrants and to people, even if even if they have US citizenship, if they're foreign born, if they look a certain way, if they are LGBTQ, that in that community, it feels increasingly under scrutiny or under threat. And so a lot of people are just saying, like, I don't really feel great here anymore. I don't feel like my rights are being protected, and are looking to, at the very least, get a second passport, and just have it, if not actually leaving and moving permanently to another country. So the secondary passport is kind of it's an insurance policy almost. So if you do have that ability, it does give you some flexibility if things do deteriorate. I'm hoping, I do expect that things are going to improve. Um, so I don't want to be too much of a doomsayer, but I do also understand if if you feel like I do understand. I think if I could get another passport, with it wouldn't be too difficult. I would
And
probably.
Shannon, I think it's important for people to understand that the U.S. government does not require that U.S. citizens renounce their passports
Yes.
if they get second or third citizenships somewhere else.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So you can get another citizenship, another passport. I would just encourage you, in addition to whatever immigration past immigration process there is in that country, that you also want to have a consultation with a tax professional in that country as well to see are you now coming into bring yourself into a different tax regime because you are. A lot of countries don't tax you if you're not living there. The US is different. If you get a US passport, you're going to be taxed in the US, regardless of whatever other country you're a citizen of. So that is something you definitely you don't want to get a passport and then all of a sudden realize, okay, now I have to file taxes in two countries or pay taxes in two countries for the rest of my life. So that's something that I would recommend. Um, if you do move outside of the US, you are going to, I mean, you're going to complicate your life, not just because now you're living in a whole different environment, right? Maybe a different language, etc., new neighbors, new community, new culture, but also legally things are going to change for you. You're now subject to a different set of laws. If you have a prenup in place, is that prenup going to hold up in that new country? your wills, your powers of attorney, etc. You have to redo all of those things if you move to somewhere permanently. If you're just moving there, say for 6 months or so, then we may not need to redo all of your estate planning. But estate laws are determined based on where you live permanently. So that's kind of where it's called domicile in legal terms, but it's basically where you're living with the intent to stay there. So if you just have a visitor's visa somewhere or a temporary visa, then we could say, well, you're still planning to come back to the US. But if you are moving there with like a permanent residency or you're a citizen of that country, then the estate laws of that country may govern. So we need to kind of relook at all of your documents that you've done. If you haven't done them, we need to do them. But trusts, for example, that we use here on a regular basis, they may have different implications in different countries. So if you move to another country, then if you have assets in a trust here, they could be subject to different kinds of taxes or punitive taxes. So we want to do all of that planning in advance before you do relocate. In terms of guardianship of your children, like if you passed away, who would be named as the guardian? It's going to be based on wherever you're living at that time. And so even if you're not permanently in that country, if you're living there for a substantial period of time, if something happens to you, guardianship is going to be based on the laws of that country. So in terms of if you're a US citizen, you're going to be subject still to US taxes, US income taxes, US estate taxes, regardless of where you live in the world. So you are going to be subject to now two ta different tax regimes. Um, and a lot of people just don't realize that. So you want to just be ahead of the game to see like what am I getting into if I do relocate. That's if you are a US citizen. If you are not a US citizen and say if you're just a visa holder, you don't really have to worry. If you're like a temporary visa holder, and if you move back to your home country, there's not going to be a lot of legal implications here. One thing you do still have to be aware of, if you do still have assets in the US, then we still need a plan for those. And that's going to be true regardless of um, whether you're a green card holder or a citizen or something. If you still have assets in the US, we still need to do planning for those assets because now when you're living in a new place, those laws are going to govern, but you're still going to have assets in the US, and those US assets are not going to necessarily be covered by the laws or responsive to the laws of the new jurisdiction. So we really need, once you're in a new place and you have assets still in the US, you need now planning in both places. So even though people are much more mobile now than they used to be in the past, laws have not really kept up with that mobility. So there's just not great solutions that cross borders. So we really do need to look at both countries and just make sure that those countries are coordinated. So most of my clients who have assets outside of the US, we work with lawyers outside of in that country to make sure that whatever we're doing in the US doesn't conflict or cause any problems for them in the other country and vice versa. So you're going to end up with a lot more accountants, a lot more lawyers, unfortunately for you. As much as we like to think that people love lawyers, we know that we're kind of
Necessary evil.
a necessary evil.
Shannon, if I could just interject for a second, I think the gray area, and you were probably going this direction, is for green card holders. I think people need to really weigh their options before they give up their green cards. I've seen this so many times. You can easily renounce your green card. You send it in with a form. It's not terribly complicated. Within 2 months or so, you get a letter saying we officially acknowledge receipt. You've renounced your green card. You're no longer a permanent resident. The problem is most people, the way that they qualified If it's through a marriage, then maybe that marriage doesn't exist anymore, or through an employer where they no longer work for that employer based on a labor certification. The majority, great majority of the cases, they cannot reactivate this green card, and people have that misnomer that they can just give it in and then 3 years later just recover it. That does not exist. You have to go through a brand new process and show that you're eligible, you qualify, jump through all the hoops. And in most cases, a great majority of cases, the foundation for that green card no longer is in place. And so people need to be very careful. Is it's very easy, like you said, just to make a snap decision. I'm going back to where I came from, or somewhere else, and then you have no recourse except to be a tourist again in the future. And obviously there's assets and there's tax implications too, and exit taxes and all that. But people need to understand the reality that this is an incredibly important decision. You can't just make it and then you might regret it later. So you have to make sure you're informed on all levels about what the repercussions of giving up that green card is. Because you're right, more people are doing it, but that means there may not be a way back, at least not the same way.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And there's two things I think kind of following up from that. One is that I think people, at least, I don't know if they still believe this, but they're like, oh, I'll just get another, especially people who have maybe a lot of money, they
Yeah,
think, well, I can just get a green card again in the future, because they qualified previously, but the laws change, administrations change. So
yeah,
your process previously that you were able to get a green card pretty easily may not be the same in the future. So if you do
no
give up that
question.
green card, I think you need to really be understand that you may not have a pathway back to that green card.
Correct.
The second thing I want to bring up is that you can easily lose your green card even if you're not renouncing it, even if you're not officially revoking that green card. So you can just say, okay, I'm giving up my green card. There's a process for that. Um, you also can not voluntarily give up your green card. Can you talk about how that can happen, Steve?
Yeah, it's not highly likely that you will have a green card revoked by the government unless you commit a crime that makes you deportable, which means obviously you would lose your resident status, or they determine that you have abandoned your green card, your residence, and that happens in two ways. One is you're gone for more than 2 consecutive years from the U.S. That is considered de facto abandonment, which means you could try to, with a valid green card, re-enter after 2 years, and they could deny your entry and physically revoke the green card and send you home. The other one is implied abandonment, which is when you show a record of very little time spent in the US where clearly you're maintaining a residence in another country. And usually you will get a verbal warning and be allowed to enter. The expectation is then that you make the US your home. You declare it, you say this is now, based on these circumstances, I was gone for X amount of time, but now my intention is once again to make this my primary residence, and then you actually do it. Because if you leave and try to come back again, they might revoke it then. Once you've gotten that warning, you either make a complete life change and come back to the US as your home, or you get ready to renounce your green card. So yeah, it can be, there's different scenarios, but people cannot just take it for granted that they have it and it's a, get into the US free card permanently, because it's not.
Yeah, and I think kind of following up on that as well, that there are some significant tax implications of abandoning or renouncing your green card. If you have been in the US for less than 7 years, then you can generally leave and renounce your green card, go through that process. I would do it officially because after you're here for more than 7 years, you may be indefinitely after 8 years. Just the way they calculated it could be between basically it's like 7 years and one day or something. So it could be anywhere between 7 and 8 years. if you have a green card for more than 7 years, you could be subject to what's called an expatriation tax. And once that is triggered, so that can be triggered either voluntarily because you're giving your green card up, or it can be triggered even if you involuntarily give it up. So that if it's revoked, if you move abroad and then the government says, well, you're not actually living in the US. So, and that's a condition of the green card, I believe, is something like you have to have the intent to permanently live here. Is that correct, Steve?
Yeah, intention is subjective, but that's why I said if you're in a position where you've quasi abandoned it and it's clear based on your travel history and physical presence or lack thereof in the US, if you're trying to rescue it or to save it from getting revoked, you have to declare that that is your intention. Otherwise, it will be implied, and this administration will never imply in your favor anything on any level. So if they see any hints of, oh wow, you're here 1 week every 6 months, it's clear you're just trying not to trigger the red flag because when you in the future spend more than 6 months consecutively out of the U.S., it's on your record. Like, okay, wait, permanent resident, but more than 6 months outside the U.S. on this trip, that kind of starts to imply that it's not your permanent or primary residence. So people do that. They'll come in for 1 week, then leave for 5.5 months, come back. But then they'll see your travel history over 2 or 3 years, and that question and that warning will come. You can only delay it so much, and that's why it's in your best interest to really consider giving it up if you really don't need it. The easiest, the people who never get denied tourist visas, Shannon, are the ones that are giving up their green card because the intention to overstay a visa is null and void. It's zero if you've shown that you don't want to stay by giving up the green card. So sometimes it's a wise decision. People really need to be honest with themselves in terms of what they really want in the next few years and the implications, because it's never good to be double taxable and all that if you don't need to be, right? So
Yeah, and this also comes into consideration with respect to do I apply for citizenship? And that is one of the reasons why, even though you are subjecting yourself to US income taxation for the rest of your life, you don't have to worry about that green card being revoked. One, not being able to come back in, but two, also avoiding this expatriation tax because if you're a US citizen, you have to like really affirmatively give up your US citizenship, your US passport to be subject to expatriation tax. And it just very rarely happens.
right.
The expatriation tax, it applies only for people who have assets above 2 million. Um, it applies also if you have US income tax liability of over about 200,000 over the last 5 years on average, or if you fail to file a Form 8854, um, leaving, which basically announces your intention to leave for US tax purposes. And even if you do give up your green card or let it expire, then and you don't fill out the 8854 or file that form, you're still considered to have that green card. Even if you can't get back in, the IRS still considers. So the State Department and the IRS are two separate entities. And even though the State Department might not let you in, the IRS is going to say, well, you didn't actually leave the US because we didn't get this form. So you really want to be deliberate and get really good counsel and advice if you are leaving the US as a green card holder.
And by the way,
Um,
Shannon, and I think we should jump into our questions in a sec.
Sure.
If your green card expires, it does not mean that you're not a permanent resident. It just means you don't have proof of it. People make that mistake too. They think that it expired and they're no longer permanent residents. It's not the case. That's your proof, and you want to have the proof. So if you leave the U.S. and you don't renounce your green card and it expires, that does not mean that you're still not liable for taxes because you're still a permanent resident until either you proactively renounce it or it's revoked officially. So that the expiration doesn't really mean much, you know.
Yeah. So all of these things, a lot of complications.
We have some questions. Should we dive in? We have 12 minutes left. What do you
Yeah. I
think?
just want to make one final point, and that is that the expatriation both is an exit tax, but it also comes with an inheritance tax. And if your children are US citizens or US residents, and they receive, if you leave as a covered expatriate, basically you're subject to this expatriation regime. Um, any inheritance that they get in the future is going to be subject to a 40% inheritance tax. So even if you're not subject, you pay this exit tax, this is going to follow you forever. So it is something to really consider very carefully and look at your whole situation before you do leave. Okay, let's dive into the questions. I'll start with them. I think a lot of, at least in the beginning, are immigration questions. So, I'm 52 years old, French nationality, physical education teacher in an international school. I am on an H-1B visa on my fourth year, still 2 years of validity. I would like to know what are the options to stay longer if my company cannot sponsor me for a green card.
Okay, so for everybody else, an H-1B has a 6-year cap. The only way to extend that is if you have what's called an approved employment-based visa application, and that requires something called a labor certification. So this person, they're at the exact sort of crossroads here because a labor certification can take 18 months, and then you need to have the immigrant visa petition submitted based on the certified labor certification, which means you need to define right now with your employer, will they or will they not sponsor you for a labor certification? Because if they say no, then you have to do something like an EB2 NIW, National Interest Waiver case, and argue that you will benefit the US by being a teacher in physical education and based on the fact that you have a degree and experience. And then you can self-sponsor. But because it takes time to process all this and then adjust, this decision needs to be made now. And Shannon, this same person seems to have asked, if I leave the US before the end of my H-1B, can I use it again? The answer is you have 6 years and you can reactivate the time that you haven't used of those 6 years. But if more than 1 year passes, you cannot reactivate the H-1B.
Great. Thank you, Steve.
Here's a
Um,
question for both of us. The last one's kind of a little bit of both, looks like.
Yeah, I am an E1 visa holder in the US and Texas, would like advice on moving here and optimizing tax as a Danish citizen in the US. Is that something you have expertise in? So I think the question, the answer to that
Yes.
is
In
yeah.
fact, this is the kind of cases that Shannon and I work on together. The first side is the visa side. E1, and I do a lot of work for Danish nationals, E1 has no limits on renewal. So you can continue to renew your E1 visa status as long as you need to. If you want to optimize your tax situation, probably you don't, and Shannon can opine on this, but probably not want to go the green card route. But you can continue to, as long as the company that's sponsoring your E1 is continuing to have transactions and movement to qualify under the treaty trader designation, and you're creating jobs, then you should be able to extend it and get new visas in Copenhagen at the U.S. Embassy as much as you need. If you want to apply for a green card, then you have to figure out which path to take and the timing, because when you do an E1, you declare that you will be going back. Your intention is to go back to Denmark. So the timing of the processes is very important. Now, the tax stuff, Shannon can talk about that.
Sure. Yeah. So for if so once you're already here as an E1 visa holder, you're going to be subject already to US income tax. So there may not be as many options for optimizing taxes as there might be if you hadn't come here yet. That being said, if you're a Danish citizen, Your taxes in Denmark are probably going to be higher than the US anyway. So there's not as many opportunities as if you lived in Hong Kong or something, for example, that we could do to minimize your taxes. You're probably going to be have less taxes just by being in the US and being subject to our tax regime. The one thing I do want to point out, which we see a lot, is that the US estate tax, the exemption for the estate tax for US green card holders and US citizens is currently about $15 million. And that means if your estate is under $15 million, there's no estate tax. If you are not a US citizen and not a permanent resident, then you could be subject to US estate tax on your US assets at a 40% rate with only a $60,000 exemption. So that is probably, I would say, like one of the biggest concerns of being here and not being a green card holder is that you probably have US assets and it could be an issue if you passed away that there's going to be a big estate tax. So this is a situation where becoming a green card holder, you're going to alleviate that, or if you get citizenship, you don't have that issue. You all of a sudden now have like a $15 million exemption. So I think that just kind of speaks to why all of these things are very complex, and there's a lot of interaction between the immigration piece of it and the tax and estate piece of it. So it is something like you need to kind of do a deep dive on.
Yeah, and there's almost no perfect, and there's no almost no perfect solution where you can accomplish all your tax related goals and all your immigration goals. You usually have to come to some sort of middle ground, and that's why it's good to work with attorneys that complement each other, like Shannon and I do.
There's another question. So one of my clients, what steps to take when running into issues detention when re-entering the country at the airport as a green card holder after vacation, completely clean immigration, tax and criminal record? I know that that is a big concern for a lot of my clients. So if you can just speak to that, Steve, if you are questioned, how to deal with that.
Yeah, I mean, given the clean immigration, tax, and criminal record, and assuming that the person has not, meaning by clean record, they have not abandoned their green card, or they've not abandoned the U.S. as their permanent residence, they have not spent more than 6 months. I'm imagining a vacation is not more than 6 months. To me, there is minimal chance of pushback here because there is nothing for the official to rest, to rest an argument on, to say that there is a problem. If none of those things, if everything is clean. The same recommendation, though, I would give that I gave in the beginning is have the number of your immigration attorney available. Because if you tell them in secondary inspection, this is my immigration attorney, I'd like to contact them, they usually will find a reason to just let you go because they can't bully you. But I would, in this specific scenario, not be worried. Obviously, you're required to carry your green card with you when you're traveling, so you will have that. And if you have a clean record in every way and you're not spending more than 6 months out of each year overseas, you should not have any problems. But just have your immigration lawyer's contact information in your phone, just in case.
And Kristen, as I know you're one of my clients, that like for our clients, always you can, if you are in an emergency, you can always call us. And we may not be able to help you, like we're not deportation attorneys or anything like that, but we can absolutely get somebody to, to connect you with. So if you are, within,
Yeah, Shannon, I have
something.
this probably comes up once a week in my practice where the people are in secondary and sometimes they'll contact me right away and I'll write a quick brief or letter or whatever it might be and get it back to the official and then they let my clients go. So this is not a deportation setting. This is Customs and Border Protection. So I'm definitely very more experienced than I would like to be in assisting people in these scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, and we have seen, I mean, especially in the beginning of the administration, and I'm not sure if it's still happening now as much, when just it's not in the news as much just because so much craziness is going on. That we do see, with some people that were kind of politically, because of political speech, even if they had a green card, they were detained. So unfortunately, it's not as, I think it's true, and that Steve is mentioning, like it's rare, it's very rare. And if the government doesn't have a reason to target you, then you're probably there's not going to be any issues. But it is good to just be aware that that it can happen and know what to do if it doesn't.
Yeah, it's a very different dynamic when you're entering the U.S. Than when you're grabbed randomly off the street by ICE. That's a different thing. This is, they have to have a justification and walk through an entire process to potentially make any major decisions about your stay or your ability to enter. And they can't. There's no way they can justify it if you have a clean record and you're a green card holder. So I would not be terribly worried. There's one more question, Shannon, and then 1:30 is our cutoff. So if you want to take that, it's a non-immigration
Yeah,
question.
I see we have some in the chat. As a US citizen, if I decide to move to the EU semi-permanently on a remote worker visa, how are taxes filed? So you will have to file taxes here. You will still, as a US citizen, you're always going to have to file US income taxes. And then you will have to consult a tax professional in, and even in within the EU, it's going to be specific to that country. So there's just going to be you're going to have to file in both countries. Does the last will and testament filed by a U.S. citizen within the U.S. apply abroad? Um, The answer to that question is somewhat complicated. And I would say if you have assets both in the US and outside of the US, we want to do wills in two different countries, depending on your specific situation. But you should not just assume that your will, like the will that you set up in one country, is going to apply to another. For US citizens who have not lived in the US since 1989 and have not paid income taxes, if they inherit a partial estate as cash, could they then be subject to decades of back taxes? Um, you need to consult a tax attorney on that specifically, that uh, because that's going to be a problem. So you need specific advice on handling that situation. Anything else? What is considered
Thank you,
wrongdoing on
Shannon, for
social
this.
media? Oh, we have to, we got, there's one more question. What is considered wrongdoing on social media in regards to immigration? We'll do that and then we'll cut it off.
Yeah, I mean, anything that implies even or can be inferred any anti-government sentiment, that's number one. And then the second one that I mentioned earlier is intent, right? So you're dating an American and but you live overseas and you put, I'm engaged and I can't wait to get married to Joe in 3 weeks when I go to the US. You are what you're doing is you're essentially nullifying your intent that you're going to declare when you enter, which is I'm coming in as a, because you can come in as a tourist and 2, 3 months later get married, and then you say, we made this decision when I was in the US to stay, for me to stay and be married. But if you put on social media, I'm getting married in 3 weeks to Joe, then, and that's there and that's public information, you have literally just blown up your own case, and you will not get a green card because you declared something when you entered as being your intent that has to correspond to your visa, and you undermined that and contradicted it by doing something else because they see it on social media. So you cannot publish anything that goes to intent when it comes to US. That's the biggest problem. And the second one is anything that's can be politically interpreted in a negative way or anti-establishment or whatever it is with the US government, because that probably will lead to a denial of your visas in many cases. So just like I said, stay off social media as much as you can and never declare intent of what you're planning to do in the US that could contradict what your plan actually is, right?
So stick to posting about your cat. Thank you.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
It comes down to. Alrighty. Thank you everyone
Always a pleasure,
for
Shannon.
attending and being engaged. Thank you so much, Steve.
Absolutely. Always a
Take care,
pleasure,
everyone.
Shannon.